Good morning, or good afternoon, good evening, depending on your time zone. I am delighted to welcome our distinguished guest and speaker to our 4th annual Gulf International Conference, the Gulf in Transition, New Factions, Shifting Foundation, and an Uncertain Future. For those of you that I have not had the pleasure to have met, in person or virtually, I am Dania, Thafer, the Executive Director of Gulf International Forum. We are proud. We are proud and very excited to welcome our distinguished guest, His Excellency Dr. Iyad Allawi, former Prime Minister and Vice President of Iraq, to our conference. As you all may already know, Dr. Iyad Allawi is a well-known leading figure in Iraqi politics. He hails from a prominent merchant family in Iraq, where he studied at Baghdad Medical School and graduated from Baghdad University. He also completed his master's at London Medical University and his PhD in medicine at Guy's Hospital, London University. He was politically active since 1968 and founded the Iraqi National Accord, namely INA for an acronym, in opposition to Saddam Hussein's regime. After the onset of the Iraq War in 2004, Dr. Allawi served on the governing council and was unanimously elected to become Iraq's first post-war prime minister. He held both executive and legislative powers, conducted the first election, and transferred power peacefully in 2005. In 2010, Dr. Allawi's Al-Iraqiyya bloc won parliamentary election. He continues to lead the INA and is a trustee of the American University of Iraq. Between 2016 and 2018, he became vice president of Iraq. Allawi currently leads the Wataniya Coalition, a national cross-sectarian political bloc. Welcome, Dr. Allawi. We are very pleased to have you with us. In our discussion today, we will address the following key issues about Iraq, shedding light on the current US-Iraq relations, Iraq's role in geopolitical trends as we see unfolding today, and its recent elections and domestic politics. Dr. Allawi, we're so happy and pleased to have you. Welcome.
Thank you very much for your introduction, and thank you very much for having me on your forum to talk about a very vital issue, because Iraq really is not only Iraq, it's a key position, it has a key position in the Middle East. Stability of Iraq will spill over stability throughout the region. Unfortunately, undermining Iraq will again spill over negatively into the region. Unfortunately, our American friends did not have a post-conflict policy after occupation of Iraq. They were lost in the wilderness, and they didn't have any positive or negative policies. They just dismantled and took decisions which hurt Iraq and really hurt Iraq. It was not only getting rid of Saddam, but dismantling the nation, abolishing the army, abolishing the intelligence, abolishing the security. Everything which was done was wrong. Even de-Baathification, politicized de-Baathification was wrong in a way. Anyway, now we are on a different matter altogether. But America, unfortunately, have lost a lot of credibility in the Middle East, greater in the world, as a matter of fact, especially after Afghanistan. And what America needs is to regain its credibility by improving its position and having clear policies what to do and what not to do. One of the mistakes that have been committed in Iraq by the Americans is not only what they did during occupation, but what happened in 2010, when we won the elections. And the Americans sided completely with Iran the administration then with Iran, and they decided not to acknowledge the winning of the Iraqi bloc. And what happened after that incident, terrible incident, that ISIS appeared on the forefront and occupied 1/3 of Iraq. Corruption became institutionalized, and sectarianism became very, very, very is the order of the day until now. Unfortunately, this was a mistake that was committed by the. They didn't even give us the chance to get to try to form the government. They just took, and this is all in the book of Rhodes, Ben Rhodes. It's written why the American did this. Anyway, now we have problems, gross problems, and grave problems in Iraq at the same time. America needs to stop having Iraq as a theater of operation between conflict between Iran and America. America needs to really reinstall its image in Iraq and amongst the people, amongst the political groups inside Iraq, and it needs to discuss through dialogue, positive dialogue and constructive dialogue, the issue of good governance and also the issues that need to be tackled in the Constitution. You know, the Constitution was written in almost 2 months and a half, and this is impossible to have. Iraq has write a constitution in 2 months and a half, and this is where we ended up now in stagnation of the political process, and people who have been negative towards the political process. And the most recent elections of 2-3 weeks ago, 80 to 85% of the electoral population refused to go to the ballot boxes because they see that the political process has failed and democracy has failed in Iraq. So really, we are resting now the results of the elections on almost just under 20% of the population that are eligible to vote.
Dr. Allawi, sorry to interrupt you. I wanted to ask you a question about U.S. Gulf relations, and then, if you don't mind, we can segue into the domestic politics of Iraq, if that works with you.
Sorry, say again?
I would like to ask a question before we transition into Iraqi domestic politics about U.S. Gulf relations. The question is, President Biden has stated that the U.S. will withdraw all of its combat forces from Iraq by the year's end, which is literally 2 months from now, except for a small mission that he plans to leave there for military assistance and training. How do you view this development?
Very negatively, and I think the missing point in the agreement between Iraq and America is the rules of engagement. There is no basic rules for engagement and why the Americans are here and what they should do and who they should obey. Is it generals sitting in the States, or is it the Iraqi commander-in-chief of the armed forces, who is the prime minister? So really, this was not clear, and I made several suggestions to the ambassador of America and also to the Americans themselves, that there should be rules of engagement, not only in Iraq, but rather in the Gulf and in the Gulf states. And now we have a problem. We are left under the mercy of the militias. And today and yesterday there were massacres in the Diyala province in Iraq. And indeed, the relation with the Gulf is not as it used to be. That's why the Gulf is turning its face gradually but progressively towards the Russian Federation and towards China. We can see that this is happening now, and this is all because of the failure of the American policies in the Gulf area, and in the world at large, not only in the Gulf area.
It does appear that the U.S. wishes to reduce its presence in the Gulf region. What advice do you have for the U.S. on how to implement such a change in its policy?
To be very honest, I think what we should do is we need the presence of the Americans, because we still in Iraq are not free of intimidation by the problems of which are occurring in the region, especially between Iran and the Gulf states. And as you know, this is now materializing into a kind of open confrontation, if you like. That's why the presence of the American troops are important, but therefore we need a kind of urgent system for engagement, rules of engagement, to decide on rules of engagement with the American forces, and to see what is their role really. Are they fighting Iran on the Iraqi grounds or on the Gulf grounds, or are they wanting to help Iraq and help the Gulf states to build themselves and to avoid dangers that will then endanger their countries? So this should be incorporated in a kind of an agreement on rules of engagement between the forces that are invited to come, like the American forces, and between the governments of the Middle East. I think this is a must. I think we should also look for a regional conference to study and to look at the possible areas of friction that should be sorted out. I have just suggested, and I'm talking to few ministers and few prime ministers on this issue, that we need a regional conference to discuss the stability of the Gulf region.
And
inshallah, we are successful in this.
Inshallah. In regards to dialogue and regional discussions, Iraq has begun to play an important diplomatic role in the region. It recently hosted a regional meeting between Jordan, Turkey, Egypt, the GCC states, and Iran. How effective, in your view, has Iraq been in advancing its interests through diplomatic soft power?
Well, to be very honest and very clear, we haven't seen anything practical on the ground happening. We saw people coming for Iraq for half a day and leaving Iraq. We saw discussions. No final statement came out of the conference, and the meetings that are taking place are not reflecting themselves by having the results on the ground. The dangers are still there. The element of Iran danger is still there, very clear. Now we have Turkey also is imposing a lot of conditions on Iraq as well as on Syria. And this is really leading the region into a kind of uncharted waters. But that's why I think personally, I cannot see any outcome of these meetings yet. We haven't found any solutions for confrontational problems. We haven't found any solutions for the relations of Iran and the militias. It's still there. It's still active. Yesterday and today in the Diyala province, massacres happened against the Sunnis, and this is not acceptable. And under the auspices of the government knows about it very well, and even no statement came out of the government to declare that this is unacceptable behavior.
And in your view, as the U.S. Changes its role and adjusts its role, do you view that regional players are going to have more of a hostile relationship with each other, or do you think it will de-escalate tensions in the region?
Wallahi, my friend, if you look at the microscopically at the region, you see the conflicts are raging and taking. Look at Lebanon, look at Syria, look at Libya, look at Sudan, look at Tunisia, look at Iraq, look at Iran, look at Turkey. So really everybody, and look at Yemen. Everywhere manifestation is all of severe conflicts that are ready to escalate rather than de-escalate. And that's why I have suggested, and I'm working towards trying to, of course, attempting to try to form a kind of a regional conference and the attendance of all parties, regardless of only few countries coming together. As we did in Sharm el-Sheikh, when I was the Prime Minister, I called upon the international community. I called upon the permanent members of the Security Council, Kofi Annan, Hosni Mubarak, late Hosni Mubarak, hosted the conference in Sharm el-Sheikh, and it was a very successful meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh. All neighbors of Iraq, including the Islamic Conference Organization, the Arab League, and the Gulf Cooperation Council attended and it was a very, very successful conference. Now we need to repeat this, frankly speaking, as the region is going into a deadlock of problems and conflicts. And these conflicts are beginning to get worse and will inflame the situation much more. As we are seeing in Yemen, for example, what's happening. Now the transfer of fight is happening into Saudi Arabia, spilling over into Saudi Arabia by drones and missiles and what have you. So really there is a danger, imminent danger on the Gulf states and on the region. So that's why we need really to get together and form a kind of a solid understanding of what needs to be done. And here America can help a lot, and the international community.
Yes, that sounds like a very fruitful endeavor. And in reference to dialogue, Baghdad has also hosted direct talks between Iranian and Saudi officials to reduce tension, which could be one of the major rivalries in the region that has been detrimental for the Middle East. Do you believe there's a chance to reduce tensions between the two most arguably most antagonistic countries?
The worst thing is really to have an ideological opponents, and the problem between Saudi Arabia and Iran is ideological, basically. And we see that very clearly that, frankly speaking, although there were some meetings here in Iraq hosted with Saudis and Iranians, I think on intelligence level and secondary lines of not decision makers, but there were no results at all. You can see what's happening in Lebanon, you can see what's happening in Yemen, and you can see what's happening in Syria. And the position of Saudi Arabia is totally against Hezbollah, totally against the militias, and they have right. And also, frankly speaking, the Iran is pressing very hard to gain grounds, political grounds, if nothing else, but at least in confrontation with the United States. And it's all done in this region, unfortunately.
And
I can't see any improvement in the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Now, the problem with Lebanon have increased between Saudi Arabia and Lebanon, Saudi Arabia and Syria, Saudi Arabia and of course with Saudi Arabia, the Gulf. Kuwait is trying to intervene, and also Qatar is trying to intervene to try to quieten down the problems. I hope they'll be successful, but I cannot see really an end to the conflict. There is a very gross difference between the attitude of Iran and the attitude of the region.
And speaking of the GCC states and Iraq, Iraq's relation with the GCC states have been steadily improving. Kuwait and Saudi Arabia have offered some help for Iraq to resolve power shortages. Also, bilateral relations with the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait are improving. How do you view Iraq's relation with the GCC states?
Well, I hope so. I hope that this will be improving continuously. I think there should be solid outcome of these meetings and this relationship. Until now, we don't find a real outcome. What is tangible, positive outcomes yet from the relationship. We have meetings and people visiting the people, but nothing yet coming out of these meetings. We need to see much more tangible evidence that things are getting better and will be getting better, or at least committees should be formed to follow up the events in the Middle East and to follow up events in the region where a lot of bad incidents are happening, from Tunisia and Algeria and to Morocco to Lebanon and beyond. Of course, beyond. Now we have the issue of Armenia, where we find that there is between Tajikistan and Uzbekistan and the Iran problem. So we find in the Gulf and the Mediterranean Sea, there is a problem between Turkey, Iran, and Cyprus, and Egypt, and Lebanon. But really, the conflict is increasing, is expanding to elsewhere. And that's why it's a high time now for the players in the region to sit down together and get their act together, put their act together, and try to find solutions for the problems before they escalate, before it's too late to have any solution for these problems.
Now, segueing to domestic politics in Iraq, how do you assess the results of the recent parliamentary elections? I know you just commented a little bit about it. And what do you think about the environment in which they were held? And what is your vision and recommendation for the government formation as a consequence of those elections in Iraq?
Well, I tell you something, that this election was worse in the history of Iraq, really. Although elections in the history of Iraq is very recent, since 2005, but this is the worst one. It was manifested by our number one, politicized money, political money, corruption money, interferences of foreigners and foreign powers, militias, intimidation, sectarianism. And beside this all, there are two things, important two things happened. The first is the irregularities that happened in the elections, especially on the biometric machines that have been used. It was impossible to take fingerprints in most of them. And secondly, and the second thing that happened, 80 to 85% of the voting population did not go to the ballot boxes. They refrained, they stopped. They don't see any results from elections. They don't see any results in the political process. They see it as sectarian based, and it's not going to be a benefit to anybody. So 85 refrained, 80 to 85 refrained from going to the election. So imagine now 15%, 18%, up to 20%. The majority of Iraqis did not go to the ballot boxes. The minority went, and they have now diversified results. And these results are causing a lot of friction, a lot of animosity amongst the Shiite themselves, and likewise between the Shiites and the Sunnis, and between the Sunnis themselves. But really, I suggested to them all and to the president of Iraq that the only way out is to have a friendly discussion of dialogues in a conference, in a national conference, Iraq conference. And maybe because even a national government, national unity government would not work. And maybe even carry on the elections again in next year in their constitutional time.
As we are running short on time, I have one question for you. And you outlined some of these issues, such as corruption, foreign interference, and perhaps also unemployment led to protests. Well, actually, certainly unemployment led to protests in Iraq in October of 2019. And these protests led, as you are aware, of course, to the resignation of Prime Minister Adel Abdul Mahdi. Um, he's the first one to resign under street pressure, from my understanding, and there was a recall for early elections. Do you believe the Iraqi government has done enough to address popular grievances? What should Iraqi authorities do more?
No, definitely not, nothing. No, on the contrary. I can send you, if you send me a WhatsApp or something, an email, I can send you information on atrocities that are being committed, unbelievable atrocities now are being committed now these 2 to 3 days, and the government is keeping silent about it. Massacres are happening in Maqdadiya province, in Diyala province. Massacres of Sunni people. This is not fair. And secondly, believe me, the issue of the election is causing a lot of fever and amongst the political life in Iraq, and a lot of tensions in the life of Iraq. And if we don't carry on a kind of dialogue, nothing is going to be done, except more conflicts will take place. More and by the way, I read from you a message that Adel Abdul Mahdi was resigned because of the demonstrations. Adel Abdul Mahdi resigned. One of the reasons is the demonstrations, not all the reasons. But he resigned for different from different other reasons, and unfortunately Mustafa Kadhimi came over. We supported him first, but then he proved to be a continuation of what Adel mismanaged, and then allowing the militias to hurt the demonstrators. Assassinations are taking place. Killings and intimidation for demonstrators are taking place continuously. And now intimidation and killings amongst the Sunnis, from Shias, militia to Sunnis. Sunnis who are not party to any, no, innocent to Sunnis. So really, it's just a shame that Iraq is passing through this phase. This is what we have been building in Iraq, unfortunately, after I left office. And because really, in 2010, we had a bloc which was composed of Sunnis, Shias, Christians, everybody, a patriotic Iraqi list. And we won the election. We had 9 people killed, then 500 people debathified as operatives and as candidates, and intimidation against others, and even blocks of Iraq which supports us were drowned in water. But yet we won the elections. But we were denied even the chance of forming a government. And then the Supreme Government Court produced a law that the larger bloc who can form the government is the bloc that can be formed after the elections. This is unheard of in democracies. So that's why we are paying now a very heavy price, and the price is really the human life. Unemployment, killings, assassinations, intimidation. It's a very sad story, believe me. I tell you, frankly speaking.
Indeed. That, I guess we'll end on this very somber point and reiterate what I think you've said throughout this discussion, is that dialogue is needed in the region,
Very much.
it's at the domestic level or regional level. And we are very, very grateful, Your Excellency, for talking to us. I know there's so much more to say about these very important topics, but I'm afraid we are out of time. Is there anything that you wanted to just briefly say before we adjourn?
Allah, there are a lot of other things that need to be said, but what I suggest is, if you give me after we finish the discussions, a communication. I think Sarah, you have the communication, Baba. I want to send you some papers and information that will enlighten what I have said, enlighten you on what I have said. And that's why I think now, if we don't resort to dialogue, positive, constructive dialogue, not only Iraq will be lost, the region as a whole will be lost.
Well, I very much look forward to reading these papers and reports. I definitely take keen interest in our forum. We'll definitely take keen interest into them. And again, we are very grateful and pleased to have you as our keynote speaker or guest for our conference. And we look forward to further engagement with you on these very important issues. Thank you. It's an honor to have you. Now, I guess we're continuing over to our panel session. And it is with great pleasure to introduce our moderator, Dr. Abdulla Baabood, for our exceptional panel titled Elections, Power, and Parliaments in the Gulf. Dr. Abdulla Baabood is a prominent Omani expert and scholar. Previously, Dr. Baabood was a visiting professor at the Middle East Institute of the National University of Singapore. He also held the position of director of the Gulf Studies Center at Qatar University and the director of the Gulf Research Center at the University of Cambridge, among many other accomplishments. We're very pleased to welcome you, Dr. Baabood. I will pass it over to you. Thank you all for joining us.
I want to add that I am currently the State of Qatar Chair for Islamic Area Studies at Waseda University in Tokyo. I want to welcome everybody to day 2 of the 4th Annual Gulf International Conference 2021, entitled The Gulf in Transition, New Factions, Shifting Foundation, and a Certain Future, organized by the Gulf International Forum. As you know, the Gulf International Forum is an independent non-profit institute with the aim to be the primary source of objective analysis on the Gulf region. This panel is going to be discussing the election and power and parliaments in the Gulf. As you know, the Gulf Cooperation Council states have all embarked on the path of modernization of their political, economic, and social systems. And they have all issued national economic visions in an effort to diversify their economies from being fully dependent on hydrocarbon, that is oil and gas exports. Economic development theory and economic literature reminds us that good governance and the creation of independent institutions are extremely important and essential part for this success. The Gulf Cooperation Council countries are not known for the prominent role of their democratic institutions. Elections may seem like a fairly new concept in the Gulf states. They have been, however, they have been taking place in some Gulf countries for years, with some of them just joining recently. With the exception of Kuwait, which has maintained a relatively active parliament and elected bodies in the Arabian Peninsula, the Arabian Peninsula countries, oil-rich monarchies, either their representative bodies are either non-existent or they're not powerful enough to have a meaningful authority. We are privileged to have here with us an exceptional, as Dr. Dania had put it, exceptional panel of speakers. And I will introduce them one after the other. But I also want to, while I will welcome them, I also want to welcome all the participants who've joined us on this panel. And I want to encourage the participants to post their question on the system, on the chat system, so that we can ask the participant to respond. Our first distinguished speaker is Dr. Naser Alsane. Dr. Naser Alsane is a former member of the Kuwaiti parliament. He was elected several times to the parliament representing the 3rd district. He took several positions in the parliament committees, member of the advisory committee of His Highness the Emir in 1992, and chairman of the Financial and Economic Affairs Committee of the Assembly in 1996. He was a reporter of the Financial and Economic Affairs Committee of the Council in 1999. And he was the chairman of the Parliamentary Committee on Employment in 2003. Dr. Alsane is well known as being a parliamentarian, but also a well-known academic. If I may, Dr. Naser, ask you the first question, and that is, how have the tribalism and conflicts in Kuwait ruling authorities affected the dynamics of Kuwaiti parliament?
Such introduction, and I send my regards to all panelists today. And I must say that I have enjoyed Allawi's dialogue. I think he raised the very important points. Now, back to the issue you raised, Dr. Abdulla. I think the tribal factor is in our region, in the Gulf region, is very clear. It's a question of to what extent you can control the intervention of tribal attitudes to political attitudes. But I must say that you mentioned not only the tribal, but also the power and the government, how we can control. In our experience in Kuwait, you can always minimize the effect of tribes. And when I say minimize, the district law, the election law, make districts sometimes where there is intensity of certain tribes. So it's acceptable and expected that this tribe will win most of the votes and most of the seats in that area. But that's democracy as well. But we cannot force them to vote for somebody from outside the tribe. That's their own right, and this is acceptable. What is not acceptable as an ethical issue is when in the tribe there are intellectual people, people with very good, deep experience in politics, good dignity, come for competition, and there are new names who have less education, less dignity, less, and then they win because of the head of tribe. They want this kind of option for people to choose. That's something ethically, I would say, but again, it's within democratic rules. But I think in our societies in the Gulf region, tribes are not negative side as I experienced. Tribes make people solid together, maybe for not a national cause, which is bad, but sometimes it will be a block that you can talk to them directly. It will minimize. We in politics, if I may say so, we spend a lot of effort contacting, organizing, coordinating, lobbying with politicians, MPs, and so on. The more you get blocks to talk to, the easier your job will be. Now, in the Gulf region, there are no political parties whatsoever. It's not legalized. The Kuwaiti constitution mentioned that it's not prohibited to form a political group, but under the law. It means there has to be a law of political parties issued before you can go ahead and form a party. So it's not, and in the consultation of His Highness the Emir when forming and naming the Prime Minister after the parliamentary election, it says that he has His Highness to consult heads of political groups, plus heads, plus ex-prime ministers and ex-parliament speakers. So there is a word for political groups, but there is no political party. In the absence of political parties, you need to get groups you can talk to ease the work in politics. For instance, in a parliament, if you want to lobby a legislation, if there are laws, if there are groups, blocks, you may need to talk to 5 people and then that's it, or 6, 7. But if there are no blocks, you need to lobby to everybody. So it will be, I think, one joke, our previous speaker of the House, Jasim Al-Khrafi, Allah yarhamah, when he received a visitor from Europe, he went to the chamber and he asked him, Mr. Khurafi, how many political parties you have in your parliament? And the total members of our parliament are 50. So Mr. Khurafi said, we have 50 parties. So that was laughing. Is it everyone has a party or what? He said, because we don't have political parties, independent people. And this is now the tribe, the groups, politically, even if it is not political parties, professions that make people together, like engineers, doctors, that really eases the work in politics, because, as I said, you don't have to talk to so many people. So that's how I look to the tribe. Now, of course, there are some negative sides of the tribe. If this is what you meant by your question, I hope.
Yes, thank you. I think you have answered this, Dr. Naser, and I'm sure we have other issues I'd like to come back to you on, as well as maybe some of the participants would want to ask. And we'll certainly come back to you. If you'd allow me, I would like to introduce our second panelist here, and that is Dr. Khalid Al-Jaber. Dr. Khalid Al-Jaber is the director of the MENA Center in Washington, D.C. He previously served at Sharq Studies and Research Center, and he was an editor-in-chief of the Peninsula newspaper in Qatar, which is a leading English language daily newspaper. Dr. Al-Jaber, in Qatar recently, everyone has been talking about the first election of the Shura Council, which is the local parliament. And the election took place, and of course the Shura Council started to function following that its first meeting presided by the Emir of Qatar. I wanted to ask you, what are the expected impact and changes from Qatar New Shura Council on Qatar itself and the region, if you like.
Thank you so much, Dr. Baabood, for having me. I would like first to emphasize the importance of election, not just in the Gulf and the Arab world. And I think Qatar today, in the first election that joined the club, I think it's a big deal. So it seems like the all Gulf countries now, they have part of legislation body with the differences between them. If we compare between Kuwait, the first one, the country started it, then the other Gulf countries came after that. And it seems like they left the biggest country in the region, Saudi Arabia, alone. But I believe it's just a matter of time, because what we see in Saudi Arabia today and opening the door in different sectors definitely going to reach political reform as well. I mean, I believe it's a matter of time for 3 to 5 years, and you can mark me with that. So I just would like first to start to put some accurate terms. I heard it a lot in the media, and when we talk about it in different panels and the conferences, when we mention democracy, maybe this is not the right word to describe the process in the Gulf. You know, the way that democracy functional in culture and in practice, it seems is different than there. We all remember, you know, the word of Abraham Lincoln when he said the nation shall have a new birth of freedom of the governance of the people, by the people, for the people. So it seemed that formula is not work is there, because ruler definitely playing the big part when it comes to see the political landscape in that region. So maybe the problem also, the basic principle of democracy is not there, and there is not really separation between legislative body and executive and judicial. And in some countries, you know, the rule will control the 3 of them, other countries 2, and the other countries, they have it like 50-50 or 60-40 or something like that. But what I'd like to use here is a political reform or even participation. And even participation, as we know, if we go back to the history, did not come with a silver plate. People fight for it, and there was a lot of battle, not just between the king, queens, even with society, you know, Protestants, Catholic. Even the idea of America started the democracy. Came with people who run from Europe and came to the state to establish sort of political participation with each other. We came with that democracy for years, and the whole process that we know. So joining that club is very important. I just want to go back the thing that you raised in the first question, and you asked Dr. Naser about the tribe. And we saw that very obvious in Qatar. And I agree with Dr. Naser. The problem that we have in the Gulf, there is absence of the party life. And the tribe now playing the big role to fill that gap. The problem is not with the tribe or with the tribal thinking. I believe the problem is when there's absence for agendas, the absence for programs, the absence for goals, the absence for a perspective. So if you go to vote in your district, you're not voting for something obvious that candidate has as a program and offer it to you. You vote to him. Maybe he's related to you, is your cousin or brothers or somebody tribe in your our member in your family or in your tribe. So I think that's our main concern. Started with the Kuwait 60 years ago, and I think it's continued, and we saw it actually is very obvious in Qatar. And I hope this will change after a while. because the way that the district is functioning now with the new law, that you're not voting in your district. For example, if I live in Al-Wakra now, in Doha, then my tribe, if you go back, when they lived in central of Doha, I have to vote in Doha, not in Al-Wakra. So mostly I don't know who's in my district. It's not obvious the candidate, the program that they have, that what create problems when they reach the parliament. And also the ideology that we saw in Qatar election, and it was obvious in Kuwait when they started it in 60. 60 years between Doha and Kuwait, that make a big change. 16 years, a lot of things happened. Maybe started a very strong ideology with the nationalists who came first and helped with the legislative body. Then it become with Islam, it played bigger role, and Dr. Naser definitely can help us to lighting that era. Then would come 1979 with other Islamists, with Shias, to play a big role as well in the legislative landscape. And so now to see the tribe, it's becoming to be the big player in that plate. And again, the problem what we saw, we like the programs, we saw a lot of women been nominated themselves, but none of them is succeeded. Not just in Qatar, even in Kuwait, the last election. And if we start the whole idea, how the woman voted in Kuwait, for example, it was only one vote and been supported by Amir. Otherwise, not even have the woman will have privilege to have right to nominate themselves to be part of the legislative body. Thank God, 2 women have been assigned, but I believe now we have to give a quota for a woman and for the youth, maybe. Why? We don't want the government to come and appoint people. I believe people choosing. So if we give like 5 women, for example, to present in the district, and people vote for it, it's better they become people choose them, not the government choose them and serve the government agenda. So, in conclusion, it's a lot of things happen in that election. Most of it, we are look at it now as a test for the future, what's going to happen. And I believe the political reform that's been going in GCC is very important, because we saw what happened after 2011 with Arab Spring, and where is the Arab countries now, the biggest at least of them. So we learned the lesson from 2011, 2021, and the changing from inside, the reform inside, does give us more stability and continue to emphasize in that path. So thank you so much, Dr. Abdullah. This is what I can say for now.
Thank you, Dr. Khalid, for tackling that question. And I have a number of questions for you and Dr. Naser, and I'll come back to you in a minute. But if you allow me, I would like to introduce our third panelist here, and that is Dr. Daniel Tavana, who is a research fellow at the Institute of Advanced Study in Toulouse, University Toulouse capital. His research interests include focus on elections, identity, and comparative politics behavior, as well as the dynamics of political opposition in authoritarian regimes. He studied these issues in the Middle East and North Africa, where he uses a variety of methods and sources of data to study electoral politics. His research is motivated by broader interests in understanding the origins of contemporary patterns of mass politics across the region. He received his PhD from the Department of Politics of Princeton University in September 2021. Dr. Tavana, since you do cover the whole region, I have a question for you, and that is, what are the main similarities and differences in that sense between the legislature of the Gulf states parliaments?
Thank you so much, Dr. Abdulla, for the introduction, and thank you to Dania, Dr. Dania, and the Gulf International Forum for helping organize our meeting today. To answer your question, Dr. Abdulla, of course there are many differences between legislative institutions among the GCC states, and we could talk for a very long time about what those differences and similarities are. There are a number of these institutions are, of course, a product of different strategies of rule. The origins of them differ significantly. The underlying relationships between groups in society, citizens of the state, and the executive branch itself is different. And of course, there are very large differences in the distributive politics or distributive policies that each state pursues across the region. What I want to, I guess, focus on in the short time I have to kind of give my remarks is the extent to which these different institutions have the capability to sort of upend or transform the underlying systems of state-citizen relations in these cases, and if so, how and transform into what. And I want to focus on specifically the nature of government interference and how it varies across these institutions, the nature of political coalitions, and electoral mechanisms that different electoral systems have for ensuring the accountability of these legislatures. On the first, I think across the Gulf, while many of these institutions have the ability to legislate or produce or draft laws, they do so under significant constraints. And this means that in practice, very often, the will of these elected legislatures, as expressed by a majority of their members, are not recognized or do not actually become law. There's, of course, significant evidence of this in Kuwait, a country I follow closely, when, for example, earlier this year, government ministers worked very closely to ensure the re-election of a pro-government speaker. In Qatar, although recent elections are of course, something many Qataris are proud of, a third of the incoming legislature is appointed by the government. Of course, in Saudi, the entire Shura Council is appointed, and in the Emirates, half of the FNC is appointed. Without question, the executive's ability or authority to legislate, which in some cases enshrined in the constitution as it is in Kuwait, or at least influence the legislative process informally, limits the degree to which we can say these institutions are truly representative. And I think this is an area in which we might see things change. Of course, like I mentioned, the Qatar example is a positive one. And there's precedent for this even within countries for sort of variation in the extent to which legislatures are willing to challenge the government's ability to legislate or interfere in legislative politics. The second point I want to emphasize is the nature of political coalitions across the region. Of course, these are not purely parliamentary systems, even though they are parliaments that are elected. Coalitions are negotiated and coalitions are not negotiated and formed as they might be in the Iraqi case, for example. And so the dynamics are a bit different. As Dr. Naser said earlier, there's no law regulating the entry and exit of former political parties or party organizations in any Gulf country. This, of course, does not mean that party organizations are completely absent from parliamentary life. There are many examples of parties and blocs, but this, of course, constrains the nature of politicking within these legislative institutions. As well, the rise of SNT voting systems, which is a feature of every country in the Gulf. Oman, Kuwait, and UAE have multi-member districts, but most Gulf countries use the SNTV system in one way or another. This limits the extent to which coalitions can be formed. It atomizes representatives and makes it very difficult for them to form the kinds of programmatic or ideological connections, both with their own citizens, but also with other candidates that facilitate the rise of coalitions. Of course, this used to be the case in Kuwait before the one-vote system, where candidates joined a number of different blocs and produced distinct electoral lists. But these dynamics encourage the government and the executive to negotiate or work directly with legislators. And I think Dr. Naser's example of the 50 political parties in Kuwait is a good one. And last, just very quickly, what I'll say is there are very different capacities in each of these cases for citizens to hold their legislators accountable in elections. Of course, in systems where there are large numbers of representatives who are appointed directly by the government or the executive, there's limits. There are natural limits to the extent to which citizens even believe that they can hold their elected legislators accountable. But they do this through a variety of mechanisms, some of which we've already discussed and maybe can discuss more, such as tribal mechanisms, interfactional challengers. For example, even within different Islamist organizations, there is political contestation and disagreement over the nature of interaction with the government and what that looks like. And of course, a broader, not just in the Gulf region, but elsewhere, the rise of independence. And this is something we can talk a little bit more about in the Q&A. Why don't I stop there? I think those are, the kind of big three points in which I think legislatures in the GCC states vary, but happy to talk more in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Dr. Daniel. I think that was quite a comprehensive overview of the main similarities and differences between these legislatures in the Gulf Cooperation Council states. And I'm sure we will have other questions to come either from myself or from the floor. But allow me to move on to our last but not least speaker and panelist in this panel, and that is Sara Allawi, who's a member of the Al-Wataniya coalition in the Iraqi parliament. Sara has been politically active in Iraq since 2010 with the Iraqi National Party headed by the former Prime Minister and Vice President, Dr. Allawi, which promotes a civil state serving democracy, equality, and justice, and constitutes the core of Al-Wataniya coalition, a national parliamentary bloc of which she is in the leadership committee. In her continued effort to promote civil and free Iraqi society, Sara Allawi works with the national and international civil society actors, including, of course, NGOs, Iraqi trade unions, and foreign missions with Iraq. Sara, by the way, studied her BA in International Relations and Arabic and graduated with MSc in International Management from the Royal Holloway University, London University, UK. Sara, we welcome you to this panel. And since you come from Iraq, we want to ask you this question, which is how the results of the 2021 Iraqi elections shape the power of the legislative branch in the country.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me. I'd like to just give a brief introduction on the elections in Iraq before 2021. Most Iraqi elections, if not all, since 2006, they have been seriously rigged, but these elections by far have seen serious irregularities. And to be honest, this was anticipated, and us as the Wataniya bloc, we warned about this before the elections took place. We saw that the same devices were used in 2018, and they're seriously flawed. Seriously flawed and subject to hacking. And there are reports on this. Asides these machines, dysfunctional machines, the conditions surrounding the elections have been dissuasive and dangerous. We have militias in Iraq. We have loose arms and unrestrained arms. We've seen with those systematic targeting of activists. There has been misappropriation of state funds, and since Iraqi people have not seen any change for the better with the Iraqi elections, especially since 2010, when the largest or when the winning bloc was deprived from forming a government, turnout has been dangerously low. 2018, turnout did not exceed 20%, and we saw the same rates, if not lower, in these elections. The laws also have not helped. The laws were changed, but they did not encourage turnout. If anything, they actually hampered turnout. And also the Electoral Commission proved incapable, and we also previously warned of their politicization. So as a result of this, we've seen that the results were seriously compromised due to the rigging. Turnout was low, it did not exceed 20%. So the results, they're not reflective of what the Iraqi people want. Again, so we've seen the results are extremely sectarian. They're not reflective of what the people want. And it's seriously fragmented as well, as we saw with the 2018 parliament, which actually blocked any reform. We saw the demonstrations that took place in 2019, and Parliament actually did not do anything to address the demands of the protesters. Following the results, we've seen serious fraying and rejection by many prominent parties and parties that held or that were previously quite influential. We feel that we have reached an impasse now in Iraq, and it's going to be dangerous because many of the opposing sides do have control of arms, and we do not want to see this playing out. We've already seen massacres now in Diyala and in the recent few days, sectarian strife, and we fear that this will spill over into the other provinces in Iraq. And again, we see that this is dangerous for the region. We believe the way forward is to have a national dialogue of all those that agree with the election results and those that reject the election results, to see what the way forward is. Our suggestion is having provisionally we've asked for a manual recount of the elections, of the election results, but we still believe that because turnout was so low, conditions should have been improved to encourage turnout. So we're asking for elections to be reheld at the constitutional date, but to work towards having a better environment. So that's control of arms, control of state funds, reform of the law, and changing of the commission. All this will help turnout and give integrity to the elections to an acceptable degree. We're not asking for 100% integrity, but at least 50%, because we've seen that it's been completely dampened. So this is where we stand today, and we are as a political bloc, we're talking to other political parties, and they have been open to this. And this is where we are. If this is not going to be addressed, we fear that violence will break out. We've already seen this, and we feel that this will be exasperated.
Thank you, Sara. If I may just start with you with one question, and given you've just explained what you think should be done, what else do you think? What are other legislative reforms that Iraq needs So to consolidate, that the parliament can consolidate more power and independence from major parties in Iraq.
We actually haven't seen any important legislation being pushed through from Parliament. If we want to see less control by the influential political parties over the legislative, then really we need to have free elections. So that there will be true representation of what the people want. The people are just so disenchanted with these parties that are the Islamist parties that hold on to power. They're fed up with regional interference as well. And in fact, what we saw in these elections is unprecedented. We did not see any civil parties win any seats in parliament, and this was almost foreseen. We actually warned about this previously. So we're seeing more of an Islamist grip over parliament. If we do want to see any reform, really it's through having free and fair elections, and that can only happen if the commission is changed, the laws are made more inviting for voters to go out and vote, control over loose arms, and to prohibit misuse of state funds. هاي تليفونك بالجيب. So can you hear me?
We can hear you, but can you put the phone off? Is it possible? Okay. Thanks.
Sure. Sorry, it's not. Yeah, sorry, it's off now.
Thank you. Yes.
So I hope that addressed your question.
Thank you so much, Sara. That was brilliant, actually. Thank you for those remarks. And let me just work my way back, if I may, and go back to Dr. Tavana and ask him this question, which is, what factors do you think explain the success of some of these Gulf parliaments, like, for example, Kuwait, to maintain their authority, while others, such as Bahrain, were not able to do so? Dr. Tavana, can you hear me?
Yes, it's a great question, and I think, leaving aside, I think, kind of explanations of Kuwaiti exceptionalism, which are quite common when this comes up. What I will say is, I think, first and foremost, I think in Kuwait there was a long-standing, I think, history of popular participatory politics that preceded the parliament in 1963, or the first elections in 1963. And this had a huge impact, I think. Historically, there were, of course, there were sort of proto-parliamentary institutions that existed before independence. There was a history of political activism and political engagement. And so when elements of the ruling family decided to include a constitution in the, to include a legislature, an independent legislature in the constitution, this, of course, was a natural kind of step in the evolution of what was, again, a long history of political participation and activism in pre-existing institutions. And I'm thinking here of the 1921 and 1938 movements, where there actually, again, were parliamentary institutions in Kuwait. I think for many other countries, it's been a very long road. Franchise is still quite limited in the Emirates, for example. There are still many legislative institutions that have a significant number of government appointees on them, as I mentioned. And so this makes it very difficult for reforms to be implemented, right? Because what would need to happen for those reforms to be implemented would be a government that effectively cedes control over or cedes influence over these institutions to other legislators or citizens or some other legislative or lawmaking mechanism. And so I think for starters, that's something that would need to happen. But as for why I think countries where there are no parliaments or there isn't a great degree of independence in existing legislative or electoral institutions, I think the reasons for that are many and different in almost every country. I mean, Bahrain did have a longer history of elections previously. That, of course, has changed in recent years. Saudi Arabia has had municipal elections, several rounds of municipal elections. Of course, it would be ripe, I think, given some of the other reforms that have been implemented in Saudi Arabia, transition to parliamentary or legislative politics would certainly be feasible and practical. But even Qatar, I mean, Qatar is a country where we now have elections, we now have a working or functioning legislative body, and though we don't know yet what that will look like, those elections were in themselves, of course, a very long time in the making, and didn't happen overnight, and happened most recently despite a very long period of promises that they would happen even sooner than they did. And so I think that there are a variety of factors, both push and pull. Even there can be progress even in some institutions, as was the case in Kuwait. There can be blowback. I mean, Kuwait, not to emphasize the Kuwaiti example again, but the SNTV system, I think, was the implementation of the one vote system in Kuwait in 2012 was a huge step back, and I think many in Kuwait realized this. And so there's, of course, now a discussion of a new electoral law, although electoral reforms have been in discussion for a very long time. These are, of course, it's not a kind of linear moving process, and we should be mindful of that too in our sort of own kind of assessments of success or failure in these cases.
Thank you very much, Dr. Daniel, for Dr. Tavana, for that answer. And let me move back to Dr. Khalid Al-Jaber and ask him this question, and that is, what do you think are the key issues that are going to be brought up to the new Shura Council in Qatar? Dr. Khalid.
Okay. Look, I would like to look to the big picture here. Everyone now in the Gulf definitely looking to learn from the Kuwaiti parliament. And I believe the rulers, again, playing the big role when it comes to that part. Because, some rulers believe they need to give at least gray area to the parliament to help them in the development process. And if we see how that started in Kuwait in 60 and 70, Kuwait was behind everyone. They make a lot of development in politics, in economy, in social life, education, health, and definitely Dr. Naser can tell us like a big list. But after that, seems all of this almost, stopped or become very slow. And that's what the problem it's become occurred in the political landscape. So all GCC look into that, the long path with Kuwaiti and try to avoid it or try to learn from it. And some of them, they're really scared of it. With Qatar, I think there is now it's a big opportunity. There is a lot of development in Qatar. It's a small country with, great resources, especially with gas and few population. And I believe the way that they look at it, and the parliament can help them a lot to continue in that development. And it will depend, if we look at it, how big is the role they're gonna play when it comes to legislative or even, questioning some ministers but definitely I don't think they will reach that point. It's going to be clash between legislative body, which is Majlis al-Shura here, or the parliament, and to the government. Because if that happen, again, we'll see the same scenario have been repeated again in a different GCC country. So I do believe the rulers, the government, the way that they look to the legislative body, how they're going to help them, they don't see it as a threat. This is going to help to do a lot of things in development process that they believe in it. From especially now after the problem with the oil, looking for alternative in economy, looking for different resources, and we're coming to push a lot of legislative in the people. Definitely, we're talking about taxes today. So imagine there's a lot of taxes on people, and there is not a good representation to discuss even these. A lot of legislative come from the government, or stop them, or at least try to change it. So that's the way I do it, and I hope that the problem or the problematic happen in Kuwait with the long journey is not be repeated in other countries. They learn from it and move forward.
Thank you, Dr. Khalid. And I think this allows me to go back to Dr. Naser and ask him the point that you just raised, that is the Kuwaiti experience and experiment with the parliament and so on, and what we hear, has it been a good example or a bad example for other Gulf states? But added to that is, how has the national dialogue in Kuwait, Dr. Naser, has changed the dynamics in Kuwait parliament? Is it a major change in your opinion?
Let me discuss the issue. The first issue you raised, whether the Kuwaiti democracy is a good thing for the region, or it makes people quite afraid of failing their development if they follow the Kuwaiti path. There is a dialogue in the Kuwait, in the domestic politics in Kuwait, that the parliament is blocking the efforts of developing the country. And that's the voice of government and pro-government press agencies and so on. But the fact is, when His Highness the Emir decided to dissolve the parliament, that was 1976 for 4 years. Another time, 1986 until 92. Those two stops, that was unconstitutional dissolvement of parliament. And those two events. During those years, in the absence of parliament, a lot of failure the country has been to. A lot of corruption issues we have witnessed. During so many periods, even when you dissolve the parliament constitutionally, which is for 60 days, or you adjourn sessions for another month or so. During these periods, we have not seen the government or the executive branch performing well. So to say that the parliament is blocking is something, a good propaganda. One time, a parliamentary question on an article that was published in Egypt against the Kuwaiti democracy that is blocking development. when this parliamentary question took through, and you know, in Kuwaiti parliament, ministers cannot avoid not answering a parliamentary question, and they have to be very precise. What we found out that was this article was funded by one of the Kuwaiti government agencies in Cairo. So it's the government making publicity, even outside Kuwait, against our democracy. It means the belief in democracy is an issue. That's what we have to start with in our region. Whether powers in the region believe in democracy, in power sharing, do they see their people as partners with them, or do they want to take far most of the power? I remember a case in our parliament, 1993. After Kuwait was liberated from the occupation of Saddam of Iraq, and we came back to our country, we decided to thank the region, which is the GCC countries. So we had a tour to the leaders of the region, and then after that we invited their parliaments or shura councils for a meeting in Kuwait. We called the meeting for Wafa. I mean, we'd like to thank them for their position. I was part of the organizing committee and the drafting committee of the final resolution. What was interesting, when every delegation came, we wanted to make a draft, and obviously a draft for 6 parliaments in the region. Of course, you have to say something, why you have met. So in the drafting committee, I was faced by some of my colleagues in the Gulf. They say, why do we have to do a final draft? We just say, thank you, Kuwait, thank to the Emir of Kuwait, and wish you a good trip back home, and looking forward to our next meeting. That's it. Who are we to say something politically or economic? No. So I found a very strong resistance among some of the delegations that we should say nothing. And when I talked to our speaker at that time, Mr. Sa'doun, he talked to the speakers of the other parliaments. They found a solution that the final resolution will be, thank you, wish you the best, and we issue another statement, the results of the economic and the political committees that worked during. It means people come with this culture that parliaments have no such power to say a word politically outside the country. And that gave me a shock at that time, 1993. That was my maybe first year in parliament. What I mean, if you go through parliaments in the region, let's focus on the issue of wealth. Okay, wealth in the constitutions, it's built in that there isn't any way to make transparency of the wealth of the country to the people who represent in a shura council or a parliament or so. And that's very, very dangerous factor. How come that a people, sha'b, people of a country, do not know what is it, their wealth, then what are the income, what are the expenses? So there isn't that kind of transparency, unless in some of the constitution, some of this wealth is being allocated to what's so-called national budget. Then this national budget has a transparency and a process. I don't need to say that some parliaments do not have, in the Gulf, do not have the right to see, not to approve, to see the proposed budget for their country. They will only be informed later on after it is issued. So the issue of wealth is very crucial. It has to be as we know the rules in democracy, there is no taxation without representation. So this is our money. You take taxes from us or tariffs or whatever, then we are who should decide where this money should be spent and how it is spent and so on. The issue of the Hiwar Watani, you said the national dialogue that took place in the last few weeks in Kuwait, is a very positive step. Now, there is a tension between this newly elected parliament, which is a year ago, and the newly appointed government. Most of the figures of opposition are former members of parliament are outside Kuwait because there are some legal action took against them, and it's law and it's a court order we have to respect. But everybody knows that it was part of it was political. Now, the national dialogue was a step between all players or major players in parliament, in government. Let's have a dialogue, but they said we don't want to repeat so many dialogues unless the political leadership endorses such dialogue. So there has been some people contacted His Highness the Emir, and he blessed such initiative, and he said, I would like to bless such thing. I endorse it. I will make 2 of my advisors to be represented in such dialogue table. So here where started a serious action to really put things together between the different fractions in Kuwait. What are the results that are expected? And I think it will happen from my expectation that people politicians outside Kuwait and activists are going to be coming to Kuwait and will join the political life. And this will ease the relation between government and parliament, because the parliament has a majority of opposition. They can block any proposal in the government. Sometimes they cannot, but they can definitely grill any minister and force him to resign, according to our constitution. If there is a majority of members, if you have 25 votes in Kuwaiti parliament, you can easily force any minister to leave, even without a reason. You may say, why is your agal is not right? Okay, I mean any reason. Okay, but you can put so many wordings. You know, in politics, as we see in different parts of the world, it might not be a serious grilling. It might be political. We just this figure, we don't want him anymore in the ministry. So in this dialogue, one of the results that are expected to ease the tension between opposition and government, then this I mean this period can maintain what you see. I must say that in our experience in the Kuwaiti parliament, not only has a reflection on the image of Kuwait. The democracy of Kuwait is a very good example. Of course, we always say it's not a full democracy. Some people, they say it's not a democracy to start with when they compare it with a full-fledged democracy. I mean, in the Kuwaiti parliament, you don't have the right to vote for confidence on a newly appointed government. Whenever it is appointed, then they are appointed, and then they even get the membership of parliament automatically. But relatively speaking, when I left the parliament after 17 years as a member, I was thinking of writing a book. What was the title at that time? It was 2009. I said I would like 17 years in a relative Arab region. And the word relatively, as we explained, and my colleagues have explained as well, because it's not a full-fledged practice of democracy. But to your question, yes, we need to develop the Kuwaiti experience and to learn from our mistakes. Our Qatari colleagues have done a very exceptional election recently. They changed a lot of what was happening. We hope they do something. I went to their laws, by the way, and I find
that. Dr. Naser, can we come back to that, because we have another round of questions and we're running out of time, if you don't mind. I just want to make a small remark, and that is no representation, no taxation without representation. We have at the Gulf at the moment, at least, we do not have any direct taxation. But let me just quickly go to Sara and ask her this question, and again ask Sara to be brief on this. And that is, given that Iraq parliament is the only parliament in the region that actually has real power and authority, but why does it not have much more participation or respect internally or externally in that respect? Sara, are you still with us? Hello, Sara? Okay, well, we're waiting for Sara to connect. Maybe she's having some connection problem. Let me go to Dr. Al-Jaber and Dr. Tavana. What do you think? Do you think that parliaments?
Can you hear me?
Oh, we can hear you now. Yeah, you want to be brief, please? Did you hear my question? Sara, did you hear my question?
I didn't hear the ending.
Okay, you're cutting off. If you hear my question, given that Iraq parliament is the only parliament. Okay, given that the Iraqi parliament is the only parliament in the region that has real power and authority, why doesn't gain much more respect and participation? Did you hear that?
Yes, representation and respect in the Middle East in general, you mean?
And internally, in terms of turnout.
Sure, because it's unfortunately it's not an independent parliament. It's not a parliament representative of popular will. Over the years, and especially since 2010, turnout has been desperately low. 2010, there was Al-Iraqiyya bloc, the Wataniya bloc, it was our bloc. It managed to win even despite the assassinations against our candidates, the rigging, and so on. And unfortunately, it was deprived of forming a government, and this was contrary to previous electoral and democratic practices in Iraq. So people lost their faith in the elections. So they just feel that elections will not bring change. They feel that parliament does not represent them. And they also feel that parliament does actually not have power. It's dictated by foreign powers, just as the political process in Iraq is overall. And that's why we're saying, we're just seeing a repeat of every election since 2010. It's a fragmented parliament. It's sectarian, and there is huge polarization between the Iraqi public and the political parties that are represented in parliament. So we're not going to see any respect for parliament and representation for them in Iraq and out of Iraq, simply because they do not respect the will of the Iraqi people, nor do they represent them. That will only change if we truly have free Iraqi elections that will respect the will of the Iraqi people.
Thank you for that precise answer, Sara, and I'm sorry about the disruption.
Not at all.
Okay, I have a question for both Dr. Jaber and Dr. Tavana, or both, either or, and that is, do you think that parliaments in the Gulf are becoming more independent from the executive branch or less? And please be precise, because we are running out of time. I have lots of questions from the floor. Who wants to go first? Dr. Tavana, go first, please.
Sure. I think that in some ways, in some cases, they're becoming a little bit more independent, and in some cases, they're becoming less. So I think in Kuwait, for example, I think for sure the switch to the one vote system in 2013 increased the dependence of the parliament on the government. But even there, we see that over time, more increasingly, the number of, let's call them oppositional legislators in parliament has slowly increased, and the degree to which the parliament is willing to interpolate ministers or challenge the government has increased, even despite this change in the legal system, in the electoral system. Sorry. So I think that's one case where there have been in some ways both kind of a positive and negative change, but elsewhere in the region, I think really, I mean, with the exception of Qatar, where we have where obviously we have new elections and a new institution, and things are, at least on paper, improving. We'll see what happens. In the rest of cases, Bahrain in particular, I think that the Bahraini parliament is certainly not as independent as it once was a few years ago. So I'll keep my answer brief and let Dr. Khalid step in.
Dr. Khalid, do you want to add anything to this? Did you hear the question? Dr. Khalid. Dr. Khalid, can you hear us? It seems that Dr. Khalid can't hear us. So maybe we could just move because of time pressure. And I have a question from a dear friend, Jane Cannemont, and she's asking Dr. Naser in particular, how is the Kuwaiti parliament responding to the anti-corruption arrests? I think Dr. Naser is the one who could help us tackle this question.
Yes, thank you. To the anti-corruption, what? Last word?
The arrests. How is the Kuwaiti parliament responding to the anti-corruption? There's been some arrests in Kuwait.
Yes.
Corruption. Yes. How is it responding to that?
First of all, I belong to an organization called GOPAC, Global Organization of Parliamentarians Against Corruption. It's a huge organization, network of parliamentarians in around 60 countries around the world. So we follow the issue of corruption from like a specialty, and we have our manuals, our reports, and so on. The Kuwaiti parliament in the issue of corruption and the arrests is very, very positive and very strong, really. And I think this is one of the images that some of the countries in the region, I mean, not only in the Gulf, I mean, in the Arab region, they don't like the way this parliament is practicing, because in the corruption issue, they have a very strong power, not in theory, but they are practicing it. They are grilling so many ministers. They are forcing them to leave. They are forcing ministers, but they are, as I said earlier, some grillings are not so deep and solid. But most of grillings are based on facts and fact sheet and figures. So to answer the question, the parliament is very strong. Although during some periods of time in the previous 10 or 15 years, we had the parliament was controlled by powers who are not interested to move the anti-corruption agenda. But during the last few years, Kuwait have signed to a number of treaties. The anti-corruption has so many corrupt people officials in Kuwait, including a person in the degree of prime minister or ex-prime minister, I would say. They found some facts against him, and interestingly enough, the person who wrote the document and sent it to the court was his deputy. Deputy Prime Minister sending such letter to the Attorney General so the court can take an action, and the procedure was followed properly, and there was no pressure from the top. Everybody respected such move. This is the highest rank example of people indicted. I mean, it's not indicted yet, but the list of crimes that was reported against him until the court, of course, say its final word. But there is his deputy, another deputy prime minister now is in the jail. So many of these cases during the last 5-6 years are making the atmosphere of corrupt powers. They fear. I would say, not as before. They were so supported, so protected, wherever you want to say. But I think as an anti-corruption activist, I see the image is becoming better and better in Kuwait. Of course, it's not perfect, but I think we are doing very well on that matter.
Thank you very much, Dr. Naser, for that. It seems that we have lost Dr. Khalid, and let's see if he can come back and join us. But we are also, it seems that we're running out of time, or we ran out of time. But if you would allow me, I would like to give each one of the speakers 1 to 2 minutes to have a brief remarks of things that we have not mentioned or things that they wanted to add. And let's start this time with Sara.
Thank you. Yes, I'd like to add a comment. It's actually further to the question you asked about, let's say, the loss of respect for Iraq's parliament. Another, which I should have mentioned, really also people have not seen that parliament has passed any important laws. For example, until now, we do not have a revenue sharing law. And there is much commotion about how Iraq's oil revenues should be distributed amongst its people. That's one example. Another recent example also is how the Iraqi parliament, they proposed changes to the personal status law. And if anything, it was actually discriminatory against women and regressing their rights. So this is another example of how parliament's actually regressive and not progressive. And really, how we should get out of this fiasco is to have a national dialogue, as Dr. Allawi previously said. Unfortunately, what we saw with these elections from the international community was that there was so much pressure by them on the Iraqi government to hold these elections, and the warnings that these elections were going to be seriously rigged, and they would result in there wouldn't be little representation for the Iraqi people, went unheeded, and we kept saying, we and others that were for postponing the election, saying conditions should have been improved so that there would be some integrity for the Iraqi elections. We do not want the international community, now that they've seen so many violations took place, they should not press the Iraqi people and the Iraqi government to respect these election results when there is now so much rejection against them, but really to encourage dialogue between the various political factions on the way forward, and also that what elections are supposed to be a means for reform, but really what we've seen here is that elections are perceived as an aim. They're stopping any reform from actually taking place. So if we do really want to see reform, then elections should actually be a means, and that will only happen when it's an all-inclusive process, and we should see encouragements from the international community on this, rather than just saying, okay, let's have elections and recognize the results regardless of the fraud and regardless of extremely poor turnout. So this is my comment, and thank you.
Appreciate that, Sara. And let's move to Dr. Khalid, since we got him back. And Dr. Khalid, we're just asking each speaker to speak for 1 or 2 minutes of things that we haven't mentioned, or something that you wanted to add. We have lots of questions from the floor, but we don't have time for that, unfortunately, and I do apologize. But Dr. Khalid, do you want to say something?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I feel like there is a lot of challenging the GCC is going to face from now maybe until like the 10 years. A lot of things is going on, actually. 2020 now, a big thing, Expo in United Arab Emirates, 2021, the World Cup in Qatar, and also the vision for 2030 in Saudis. So I believe to maintain this development, this changing, you have to give people a voice. They need to be part of that development. They need to talk, discuss, be part of organization, legislatives, and I wish we can even reach some point that we allow people get together. Let's call it a different form. Don't call it the party. Let's call it like organization, whatever. But they need to get together and adopt goals, adopt a vision, and allow them to participate and to execute that vision. I think this is the only path will help to the future. The problem is when you face that choice to stop against that willing, you will find a lot of problem. And not just since 2011 until now, even for like 50 years, we saw a lot of experiences when it comes to people participating in the Gulf. When they adopted from like the countries and the all partnership between rulers and the people, with a different background, Sunnis, Shias, or Hadar Badu, that's what we call it in the Gulf. We saw that the big jumping, but when the conflict become with everyone and the government start to invest in that conflict, we see the most countries that's been behind, and that's what we see also in the Gulf in the different countries. So the future should really be a partnership between people and ruler, and they need to believe in that, the only path for the future.
Thank you, Dr. Khalid. Let me just add something as a moderator, and that is to say that, of course, at the moment in the Gulf states, parties are not allowed, but there must be other means of getting people to get together beyond a tribal coalition. And in Oman, and particularly in Salalah, there is a coalition that's called the Salalah Coalition, and that transcends actually tribe and tribal affiliation, and has been winning elections since the last few rounds. So maybe that's something that perhaps could be studied a little bit more. Daniel, let me come back to you and conclude with 1 or 2 minutes, please.
Thank you, Dr. Abdulla, and thank you again to Gulf International Forum. I think I don't have a lot to add, just to say that how nice it is that there is a panel on elections, parliaments in the Gulf, and also how rare this is. I think typically, especially in Washington, but not only in Washington, when we talk about the Gulf, we think about things like security, oil, energy, terrorism. And so it's quite nice actually to be able to convene a panel of this type where we can talk about political developments in different Gulf cases, the nature of legislative and electoral politics. And so I want to thank Gulf International Forum for putting together a panel of this type where folks from different countries and of course myself from outside of the Gulf can get together and have this conversation. And I think an important theme that we've talked about today is, are things going in a positive direction or negative direction? Are things getting better or worse? And where are we headed? And I think that only through conversations like this can I think information be shared and folks learn more about what's happening across these cases. This, of course, facilitates historical or contemporary comparison, right? And other kind of analytical things that I think we need to have these conversations. In order for things to improve or get better, there has to be a constituency on the ground, of course, that wants that. And if we don't understand the domestic politics of these countries, again, externally as other scholars or researchers are sometimes not interested in, right? Then we can't really assess in which direction things are going, if things are improving or if not. And so I hope that these conversations continue, and I hope that there are more panels on elections and parliaments in the Gulf, because these conversations are important and I think increasingly needed and unfortunately missing from much of the policy conversation, again, especially in Washington and in Europe.
Thank you, Dr. Tavana. That's very important what you've just said. Let's move quickly to Dr. Naser Sana.
Yes.
Concluding remarks?
Yeah, what Daniel just said, the need for research on democracy in our region is really badly needed, because this is the only way out of this crisis that we're living. Now, there is less confidence between rulers and people relatively in different levels in countries. I mean, in one of the Gulf countries, when activists wrote some article, they signed on it, they need to empower their parliament. As simple as that. Most of those who signed now in the jail for 7 or 8 years. Okay. In some parliaments, in some societies, if people talk about empowering the parliament or getting the people to share in power, they might be blacklisted and so on. I think the message to the rulers and governments in the region that participatory democracy and election is a national security issue for the countries. They will have to look at it not as a threat, but partnership with the people is something maintains the national security of countries. I give you one example. In Kuwait, and I think in most of the people of the region, people are against the signing any agreements with Israel. Okay, but because of political pressure and international pressure, some countries will had to sign and so on. If you have a parliament like the pressure we're having in Kuwait, why don't you join the Abraham and be part of this? The answer in the Kuwaiti authorities, I assume, this is not an information, but as an assumption, that they will say, okay, to do so, we need to get it approved by the parliament, and majority of parliament are against it. It works very well for the interest of the country. I give you one last example. I'm sorry if I extend my examples. But when you invited me, you said, we want you to speak from your experience. One year, we had a deal, a military deal of 1.2 billion US dollars with a British company. I was member in the parliament, and I had information that this deal is a corrupt deal. We don't need it. Minister of Defense, he said, you don't understand military, Dr. Naser, why you interfere? I said, those who informed me are very well professional. We had this dialogue. I put to him questions. He answered transparently. He came to a point where this deal is not needed for the country. And he wrote a letter to the parliament, to the budget committee, cancel the allocation of such deal, 1.2 billion. The British politicians, I mean, Prime Minister and Minister of Defense, had such traffic of calls to our ministers. I talked to our defense minister. What did you have? What did they say to you? Because Kuwait against UK it's a superpower. I mean, people will say, come on, move it, whatever they want to sign. Don't confront such powers. So our minister said this conversation, and I remember that. He said, the minister in UK called me, he said, why you cancel the deal? And I simply said, because our parliament is against it. The British minister said, okay, that's reasonable. Thank you, Mr. Minister. I just have a pressure from this British company and I have to call you. And then that was it. So that was a support to our resources, to our government, to our country. If this partnership is built on a logic, putting the experience from all the countries, I mean, in the developed democracy, I think this is a message has to be to the decision makers that democracy is for you and for your security.
Thank you, Dr. Naser. Allow me to, first of all, thank all the participants for joining us in this important event. I'm sorry we could not get all your questions posed to the panelists because of the shortage of time. But I think we have learned a lot from the panelists' insights and their experience and their knowledge in this subject. So, please join me in thanking all the speakers for their contribution to this very important topic. It is obviously a topic that we will come back again at some point. And I also want to thank the Gulf International Forum and Dr. Dania Thafer and her team for organizing such an important event, and also encourage all the participants to follow the event, which I think there is a continuation to this tomorrow. So from me, from all of us, thank you all very much. And wherever you are, have a nice day, a nice evening, all the very best, and great to meet you, even if it's online, virtually. Thank you. Bye-bye all.